My name is Joe Peroni, and this is the Rise Above Project. And today is going to be part 2. We're going to talk about how unmet childhood needs leads to lifelong adaptations. Now, I'm going to try to do a quick review because this one definitely ties into the first show. And I'm going to do this in less than a minute, so don't worry about that. So in part 1, we discussed 3 ways that children defend against their unmet needs. They reject themselves, they reject others, and they choose or they provoke or they encourage others to treat them in the same abusive, neglectful ways that they were treated in childhood. If we conceptualize those 3, it would really mean the words, I can't. Now, it doesn't mean that kids just give up. It doesn't mean that they don't want their needs met. It means that they literally cannot get those needs met from their caregivers. So now they need to do some type of compromise solution. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So part 2, 3 ways that children try to rise above their unmet needs. And there's 3 of those. So number 1, they're going to move towards people. Number 2, they're going to move away from people. And number 3, they move against people. Now, if you were to conceptualize those 3, you would say they're versions of I can. And not just that I can, they need to. So they're going to try their best to try to get some type of their needs met. So what they do is they adopt, very unconsciously though, by the way, they adopt a relatively fixed interpersonal style. And they do this to reduce their anxiety and to get some type of gratification, some type of happiness, and some type of external validation. By the way, therapists are always on this about how human beings shouldn't need external validation. Unfortunately, that's not true. Without external validation to start off with, it creates all of these adaptations that I'm talking about. So human beings definitely do need external validation. Of course, there's levels of it. We can get to that at another time. But just know there's nothing wrong with any human being for needing external validation. As a matter of fact, it's 100% necessary in order to have healthy development. So let's talk about these 3. Number 1, moving toward people. So at a very young age, children start to realize that they could earn approval and somehow maybe diminish the threats or abuse that's coming their way if they can please their caregivers in some way. So what does this look like? It looks like being very compliant, never talking back, being overly nice, overly good, never showing anger, always keeping their composure. Now, this part's interesting. Like, why would that be? It could be, and probably is that if they show anger or any type of emotion that the caregivers don't want, there's probably an incredible punishment for that, whether it's being hit or verbally abused or shamed, all of that. So what they do is they try to learn as much as possible to keep it all inside so they can make themselves really, really small so nobody sees them, so they never get in trouble. People like this, they tend to be very submissive, very accommodating. You see this in adults all the time. They move towards, well, the word people like to use a lot is codependent. And so I would agree with that. Yes, people like this are definitely codependent. If you know about the big 5 personality traits, we would say that they're overly conscientious. Again, they're trying to get everything right all the time. They don't want to stand out in a negative way, right? And they're overly agreeable. Again, if somebody's agreeable all the time, how can they get any negative punishment towards them? It lessens it a lot. They move towards perfectionism. Again, why would they do this? Because they feel and they learn at a very young age that the more perfect they are, there's less to criticize them about. So if you're a kid and you're getting straight A's and you have a sibling and they're getting C's and D's, they're going to get most of the negative attention while you're getting your straight A's. And you can go down the line on this too, of like the people who are overachievers in sports and things like this, they get a lot of positive attention. So they're very afraid to get anything wrong. People like this, they tend to get careers in the helping professions. Now, I know a lot of people who do these YouTube channels, they try to be the sage on the stage, like kind of like a little bit of above it. And so while you're watching this and trying to figure this out for yourself, realize something as I'm talking about moving towards people as being a way to rise above unmet needs. I've been a personal trainer for over 35 years, and I've been a licensed marriage and family therapist for over a decade. And within that time, I've also been doing radio shows, TV shows, and YouTube channel shows for over 10 years. So I just outed myself. If you're keeping up with the program, you already know that I don't just have book knowledge on how to move towards people, is what I'm saying. So none of us are perfect, by the way. People that move towards people, they tend to see themselves as being endlessly loving. Unfortunately, they end up getting with people that are not endlessly loving. They tend to feel that they give more than they get in almost all their relationships. And actually, they kind of want it that way sometimes too, like where they work. If they get paid a certain amount, whatever that amount is, they want to be able to be more valuable and worth more than what they're getting paid. They're usually the one that's going to stay late, put in a little bit of overtime, not expect to get paid kind of thing. They're very sensitive to the needs of others, and they're committed to peace and harmony in their relationships. So that's a pretty good synopsis of moving towards people. Now, moving against people. These people at a very young age, again, unconsciously, they adopt an interpersonal style to try to control other people. And they're also very controlling of themselves. They're very tight about everything that they do. Very regimented, I guess is the right word. These people tend to be very angry, demanding, self-centered. They try to protect themselves from experiencing difficult emotions from their childhood traumas and their developmental needs that they did not get. So they tend to be very aggressive. They are controlling, unflexible, very much black and white thinking. Not a lot of shades of gray. They can start arguments real quick, and it's hard to get into good conversations with them because they see it only one way, and it's hard to move them off of their point of view. They want to take charge all the time. Nothing really wrong with that. Society will pay you very well for being a good take charge kind of person. People like this, a lot of times, not all the time, but many times they have a career in law, which is good for a lot of people because then they get to argue with people and get paid. So you're getting paid to be argumentative, and which is right up their alley anyway. People tend to be in medicine a lot because they're very high up on the food chain, and they're not going to get bossed around a lot because they're at the top, and they get to boss other people around, and they do have a good power position. Again, they want to be in charge. People like this like jobs in money management, again, because they're managing others, and so that works well for them. So number 3, moving away from people. People like this, they tend to want to decrease their anxiety, and they defend against their unmet needs by being physically avoidant. They just don't want to be around people. They're very withdrawn. They can also, they are emotionally avoidant. In other words, they don't want to be vulnerable with others, so they don't want to release their emotions, and they're very standoffish about other people's emotions as well. What kind of jobs do they have? I can't think of a lot. Things that you're more isolated, maybe like a research scientist or night watchman kind of thing. Interestingly enough, I know a lot of musicians that you think would be very open, happy, and gregarious. A lot of them like to work in isolation, and they see working in clubs in front of people as being a necessary evil because they're on the shy side. And I can see that because I've competed in bodybuilding almost all my life. And I love working out. I see it as a very singular passion. I still do. But if you want to compete, you have to be in front of people. And I never started bodybuilding because I wanted to get applause from other people. That's not what I wanted. I actually hate that. So it becomes a necessary evil to be in front of people sometimes. At least that's the way people can feel about that. So those are the three ways that people rise above their unmet needs. Now, here's where it gets a little more complicated. We have to understand that these are ways that people are trying to rise above their invalidating developmental experiences. In other words, this is the best they can do, but it's not ideal. These are defensive reactions to interpersonal trauma. So again, that has to be stressed over and over again. Again, not ideal, but it's the best they can do. But here's where it gets really tricky, is because most people that are rising above their unmet needs this way, they don't understand that there's a problem with it because they're not actually addressing their original narcissistic childhood wound. So what happens here, again, very unconsciously, they're going to find a way. When I say they, I mean me too, just so we're all on the same page. I'm not above it. We all try to find a way to turn our defensive strategy into, and this coping style into a virtue. And that's where it gets really interesting, because we use this virtue to make ourselves feel special, to feel superior, to feel worthy. It gives us a sense of identity, and it gives us our self-esteem that we were so lacking and so much needed. People don't experience their interpersonal coping styles as a way to defend anything. They see it as a way to be in society. Again, they see it as a virtuous way to make themselves feel confident. They have mastery over it, and they do get validation, and they do win approval. And of course, what happens from there? Anxiety goes down, their shame goes down, and all is good. It seems like it's all good. And you get praised for it. You might get paid for it. You get, wherever you are on the spectrum, you get girlfriends, boyfriends. It's like everybody can love you if you rise above your needs enough. But the individual and the people around them most likely don't see the inner wound that they're trying to cover up. We'll get to that later. So what happens here, for example, why they don't see it's a problem. If you're a moving towards person, me, you don't see that you're being overly submissive. You don't see that you're being overly compliant. You don't see that you're bending over backwards for people and you're afraid that they have a bad feeling. So you're trying to manage other people's emotions and you're not being your true self. You don't see that. You see yourself as being an incredibly empathetic, loving, super nice, caring person. Now, the big discussion here, and I've had this so many times in my career, I don't mean to shame anybody, but we cannot, if you're a person who moves towards people, we have to move away of saying that you are a super empath. Because if you say that you're a super empath, and believe me, empath or empathy is probably the number one skill a therapist needs, and it's probably the number one skill that anyone would need to have a good relationship. All that's true. But if you see yourself as a super empath, one who will always make yourself small to make your partner feel big, if you're always willing to dim your light to make somebody else shine, if you can try to manage somebody's emotions and feelings and try to predict if somebody's going to be angry at you, so you change who you are to avoid arguments and to avoid the yelling and to avoid the pain, let me tell you a secret. And if you hear nothing else today, please hear this, because this will change your life. That's not empathy. That's hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is a symptom of PTSD. So again, it's great to be empathetic, but if you call yourself a super empath because you're letting people walk all over you and hurt you, and you're like, I'm the good one, because I'm allowing all this negativity to happen around me and I'm not making appropriate boundaries, that's not empathetic. You're trying to predict how and when somebody's going to abuse you. So you're hyper vigilant. So we really need to take a look at that. So let's move on to the next one. If you're a move against person, you don't see that you're angry. You don't see that you're demanding. You don't see that you kind of don't listen to people and you could hurt people easily. What you see is that you're a hero. You see that you're a leader, because leaders don't need to compromise. So the more of a leader you are, the less you're willing to compromise. So you see that as a virtue. You don't see that you were hurt a long time ago. And now you're going to lay into other people and you're going to say, well, that's because I'm a hero and I'm a leader. We have to work on that a little bit. People who move away from people, they don't see that they're emotionally unavailable. Their caregivers were emotionally unavailable, so they become emotionally unavailable as well. And they wear that as a virtue. I don't need people. What they do is they look at other people and they get very cynical and they feel like they're above it. And so to them, they don't see that they're emotionally unavailable and they're hurtful to others and how distant they are. What they see is that they're this incredibly intelligent person who just doesn't want to get in there and mix it up with the common folk because they're above it. Again, they're cynical. They look at people in a very negative way. So they get really have this superior attitude towards that. But again, these three, getting value in this way to someone who really knows. And again, like my father said this a long time ago, at some point all bills become due and payable. These defensive strategies work. They work really well for some people. You can name a lot of famous people. Here's one behind me, Jimi Hendrix, right? He rose above with higher achievement in order to rise above his developmental needs. But if you don't look at the inner wound, we're going to have issues. So getting value in this way, it actually reflects low self-esteem. It reflects inner shame that you don't want people to see, and you don't want yourself to see it. For example, moving towards people, it's based on pleasing people. You know what? Pleasing people, it's not in your control. That means you don't have the power in your life you thought you had. That's number one. How about people who take on winning and achieving as a way to rise above their unmet needs? Well, number one, winning and achieving all the time, it's not in your control. That means if you lose, that means you're a horrible person, right? Maybe. It doesn't, but you can feel that way. It's also not a good long-term solution. You know, think about people who try to win all the time and achieve, and they look at themselves as like, I actually feel really good because I'm amazing at something. Well, if you base a lot of your self-esteem off of your looks, when you're a teenager, when you're in your 20s, 30s, try that same technique when you're pushing 50, 60, and 70. It's not a good long-term plan. At some point, you're going to have to be okay with who you are and not what you do. You know, take it from someone that's got 3 college degrees. Up on my wall here, I'm looking at a diploma from Yale, and I have like over 75 bodybuilding trophies. And I wake up most days going, what have you done for me lately? You know, it's like, I got to do more, right? Like, you know, so you have to be okay with who you are, not necessarily getting that next goal. And if you're going to live like that, always trying to get to the next goal, the next thing, or to make somebody pleased, you are putting your psychology in other people's hands. And that's not always a good thing to do. Moving on from that, let's say we're the person who moves away from people. You withdraw from people, feeling cynically superior. Not a good long-term plan. I mean, for most people. I'm sure there's somebody out there that gets along that way. But human beings are We're wired. We're wired for connection. So if you figured out that being connected to people is very dangerous, you're going to use a compromise solution, and that's to run away from people. That's maybe the best you can do, but it's still not ideal. You know, it reminds me of that fable where the fox is trying to get to the grapes, right? He can't reach the grapes. So he says, screw it. I don't want grapes. I don't like grapes. Well, you do because you were trying to find them. You were trying to get them. And he says, the grapes are probably sour anyway. And he tries to make himself feel good, but he knows he's lying to himself. And it's the same people who are very withdrawn from people. Like, I don't have any interest in people or relationships or anything like that. It's like, well, what you do, you just don't want to be hurt anymore, and that's what you see. But overall, human beings were all wired for connection. And the one of the, I can't say the number one thing, but one of the many things that are destroying our society right now is loneliness from isolation. You know, whether it's emotionally or just physical distance. So what happens here, when we're rising above our unmet needs in these ways, and some of us are doing it through trying to please other people, and some of us are doing it by trying to achieve a lot. You know, I'm a doctor now, I'm going to be happy. You know, it's unfortunate. 2 months ago, I know this doctor that committed suicide. Listen, all the money in the world is not going to save you. You know, all the fans in the world are not going to save you. You know, ask Michael Jackson. You know, it's just, I don't mean to laugh. I'm just saying, it doesn't. You need to heal in here. What happens is when you're trying to rise above these unmet needs this way, your love that you're getting, the love that you're receiving becomes conditional. It's conditional on you being perfect. And that can't happen forever. Right? So what we needed was unconditional love. We didn't get that. So now, instead of trying to figure out a way to love ourselves for who we are unconditionally, we've done a compromise solution. And we do that by doing all these other things to make people stand up and cheer and go, you're a good boy, you're a good girl, you're awesome. Let me give you a raise. You're the best worker I've ever seen. You're the best slave I've ever seen. Anything I want, you do for me. No matter how bad I treat you, you're still there. And inside you know better. And if you don't know better, again, like my father said, at some point all bills become due and payable, because this is not a long-term strategy. Or you could be like Jimi Hendrix, who only died at 27. So I don't know if he ever had that vision of being a high achiever, just as, well, he did, obviously. Being a high achiever for him, being the greatest guitar player who ever lived, still wasn't enough to keep him happy. Because he knew inside. I mean, he used to go to sleep with a broom when he was a kid, because it was shaped like a guitar. And that was his love. You know, how sad. You know. So here's the major conflict. The defensive coping style becomes the number one source of the person's self-esteem. Because it works. Because it gets you everything you want. And the problem here is like Maslow would say, is that you want to be self-actualized. And I agree with that 100%. But the problem is, being that these defensive styles are unconscious, you think you're actualizing yourself, but you are actually actualizing your ideal self, not your real self. So you're actually getting further and further away from who you are as a person. You're not actualizing your real self. In doing this, it can't be maintained forever. Your self-esteem is based on something flimsy, and you're not addressing the original narcissistic wound. So the big question, how as human beings do we deal with the fact that rising above our unmet needs, that works, that we've done unconsciously, that is a massive part of who we are, our identity, and our self-esteem? What do we do with that when it becomes too big of a burden to carry anymore? And we can't hold up that facade anymore. And we need another strategy. What do we do at that point? And I think that's what some of my other shows are going to go on. I don't know how many parts I'm going to do here, but I don't want to get into that because I think I gave up a tremendous amount of material today. And it's hard to digest. I don't mean for you listening. I mean for me. There's just a lot of information here. In speaking to rising above an unmet need not being a long-term plan. Roger Daltrey is my favorite singer. He's a singer from The Who. And I remember him saying that you would never have to quit the music business because the music business will quit you. It doesn't matter how good you are. Like, even if you're the greatest in the world at it, when you live in a capitalistic world and people are like, we value youth, old people are getting pushed towards the end of the line. And what happens is that you get pushed out. There's a version of like planned obsolescence. And unfortunately, it's that way with human beings. Like, you could be a personal trainer and you could have tremendous amount of wisdom. You could have 40 years of experience up against some 19-year-old kid. But the 19-year-old kid is going to be more dialed in to other young people. And I've seen it so often that you need a better plan because you're going to be obsolete. I don't want this show to get too long. It kind of is already, but there's a couple of things that I really want to say here. I think I want to do a whole show on using examples of people that were amazing at rising above their unmet needs. But then, when their carriage turned into a pumpkin, they weren't able to make that transition. So I think that's where I can be helpful, is maybe moving towards people like being able to make that transition. And the first part is the awareness to know that if you're rising above unmet needs and you haven't checked inside yourself, you got an issue coming up. So let me talk about, let me see if I can do this pretty quick for you. I know we're 27 minutes in. I don't want to take everybody's day here. But one of the most important people in my life was Steve Mahalik. It's hard to talk about still. Steve Mahalik was Mr. Universe, and he was Mr. America. And he took me under his wing when I was just a little kid, and I didn't have any money. And he said I could have a free membership at his gym as long as I was willing to work hard. And Steve was bigger than life. Just such an imposing figure, one of the best bodybuilders in the world, worldwide respected in this sport. And I just loved to be around him all the time. He was like a father to me. And I was very young, and so I didn't know much about psychology then. You just see Steve and you're like, everybody looks up to Steve. He's the best, And I never really realized this because he never talked about it, but he wrote a book a long time ago, and he talked about how he was, very severely physically and emotionally abused by his father and neglected. I mean, he spent days at a time locking himself in a closet trying to avoid his father. And he used to read comic books, and he said, I will be big one day. I'm going to be a superhero. And heck if he didn't. He was a superhero. Here's the issue, though. He was never loved. He had a lot of inner hate towards himself and a lot of inner shame. He rose above it by being one of the best bodybuilders in the world, and everybody loved him. People came in from all these different cities. This is before the internet. People would travel all over the country just to have a conversation with him, and he felt like a king, because he was. But he never handled his inner demons. And Steve, like everybody else in this world, he got older. And he became a little bit more diminished until he was older and he had a stroke. And it didn't kill him, but Steve couldn't be Steve anymore. This whole bodybuilding facade, this wearing of this gorilla suit for all these years, was his whole identity and his whole self-esteem. And he couldn't transition from that to be just Steve. Steve, the the man of wisdom, the people who looked up to him in terms of business and what he's done in his life and just being a good man. And, you know, someone who is worthy of love. But he wasn't able to do that. So he went home and he shot himself in the head. And people couldn't understand why. It's because he was never able to understand that he was rising above his unmet needs and never addressed the actual inner issues. I would have loved Steve. I loved Steve when he was 260 pounds. I would have loved him if he weighed 160 pounds. But Steve wouldn't love himself at 160 pounds. And so he didn't want to be here anymore. And I think there are a lot of people are like that. I could do shows on different people like that if you so choose. So how do you fix this? It's a long process. I'm going to do it in like a minute. So I'm just going to show you just a quick little thing, if I can, of how to do it. Because when you're doing all these things, you're trying to please everybody. You bend over backwards for people. You're in a relationship for 20 years that sucks, and you're still trying to make it work because you just got to be that good person. You know, you want to make the most money. You want to be the highest achiever. You want to win everything in this world. And if I can do all that, I'll actually love myself, and people will love me, and it'll all be okay. But really what you're doing here, you're walking around with a note on your chest. And it says this: you're telling people you didn't get the love that you needed when you were a kid. You needed unconditional love. So for the rest of your life, if you were a type of person that had a difficult childhood, you need people to love you. But you're putting up a facade because you don't love yourself. This is what you really need to do. Take these words, put them on your mirror, and you look at that every day. Because the truth of the matter is that nothing really, fully, and completely gets better until you love yourself. So when you look at yourself in the mirror, understand the words. That person looking back at you, that person needs you to love them. That's you. You can't get it through all these fake means. It'll only last so long. It's flimsy, and it's not a permanent solution. But loving yourself is a permanent solution. So we have to work on that. So my name is Joe Peroni. This is the Rise Above Project. Hopefully this had some value to you. If you want to leave some comments or anything like that, I'm open to that because I like other people's points of view, and I could always learn from other people. I don't have all the answers, that's for sure. But anyway, please subscribe and tell a friend if you find value in this. Thank you very much. Take care.